Bye.
Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Matthew Reypert, Head of IT Service Delivery at Hodge Bank. There'll be plenty of opportunity at the end of the talk to ask Matthew questions, and I kindly ask that you put the questions in the chat facility, where Sarah will collate them ready for the Q&A session at the end. I'd like to say a big thank you to you, Matt, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and speak with us today. So I'll now hand everybody over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Just take control.
You see that okay, Matt?
Yep, that's fine. It's all good. Okay. So yeah, thanks Claire for the introduction and the invite to come along. It's always really useful to sort of spread the word of Hodge and sort of what we're doing, because we're sort of a relatively small company, but it's good to sort of get our name out there so we can sort of engage in partnerships like this. So it's a really useful opportunity for us. If I start with a little bit about Hodge Bank, because we're not that well known, we're not a massive company, but we are sort of a relatively large employer within Cardiff. So we are a privately owned bank based in Cardiff. We're sort of just outside, we're in One Central Square, which is just outside Central Station. We offer a range of products across savings to sort of retail people with ISAs and bonds, mortgages and commercial lending. We got a balance sheet of around £2 billion, and that's growing. And that growth, we've got big growth plans for the next couple of years, and that growth is driven by tech. So we know we can't grow by just throwing people at our processes, because that's not really an efficient way of doing it. And also customers want to be able to self-serve and do things online. I think probably 10 years ago, our traditional customer base was very sort of older demographic, paper-based, happy to fill in forms, happy to ring us up, have a chat. But if you're sort of trying to sort of engage with the market these days, you need different ways of interacting and also better tech to support that. The other sort of interesting thing we're doing at the moment is we are investing in a couple of local tech startups. So there's Yoello. And if you've been to a pub in Cardiff in the last 2 years, you're bound to have seen the Yoello QR code and the app. So they're a sort of payment provider, but they've also engaged with the sort of hospitality industry to allow online ordering and things like that. Their growth has been sort of massive through the pandemic as sort of people move to contactless delivery and stuff. The other one we've done, which was announced last week or the week before, actually, is pretty new, is Zero, who are again a Cardiff-based startup who support carbon neutral building and living. So working with builders to sort of make their processes more green, but also working with homeowners to allow them to sort of manage and monitor their sort of carbon footprint. So that sort of ties in nicely with our commercial lending, because we do quite a lot of work with developers. So there's a good tie-up there. Last thing I'll say on Hodge Bank is we're pretty unique in terms of our ownership structure. So we are majority owned by the Hodge Foundation, which is actually a charity set up by Sir Julian Hodge many years ago. So they own most of the bank. So profits and dividends all go back to the foundation, and then foundation provides grants to medical sort of research charities, education charities, and sort of does a lot of work in welfare. So a lot of the money is sort of invested locally in community projects. So it's interesting. It means that we're sort of not beholden to sort of shareholders who sort of are demanding massive growth and sort of short-term gains. But it also means that everything we do at Hodge is ultimately for the benefit of community projects, which is pretty unique as a sort of employment proposition, I think. So a bit about my role. The official job title's at the top, which is Head of IT Service Delivery, DevOps and Cyber, which is a massive mouthful. But it does sort of do what it says on the tin. Those are the sort of main areas that I cover. So I report in to the CTO. I suppose you could traditionally think of IT as two halves to IT. There's the build half, and then there's the run half. I look after the run half. So that's everything that's in the live environment is sort of my responsibility to keep running, keep maintained, keep secure, keep it performing, but also engage with the build half of the IT team, which are doing the development of our web apps and our applications, to make sure that anything they build is sort of moved into service as seamlessly as possible. So I've got sort of 4 key areas that I cover, and I've sort of got a team of each area below me. So one is service provision, which is, as a starting point, is end user support. So it's the service desk. So if you've got a laptop and it's broken, you contact the service desk, or if you need access to a report, you contact the service desk, and anything you traditionally think of as IT service desk comes to us. We also look at that team is also responsible for sort of making sure the infrastructure and the apps are up and running, so they'll respond to any alarms or alerts, and they work with the other teams to sort of investigate any application issues as well. There's also user requests, as in users want different access, more equipment, new equipment, things like that, and also starters and leavers. So as we grow, we're sort of expanding our user base pretty rapidly at the moment as well. So that's quite a big sort of part of what we do. And ultimately, the service desk are one of the faces of IT, because if everything's going swimmingly in IT, you probably don't come and talk to us that often. But if you do have a problem, then it's service desk are the first people you'll see. So it's really key to make sure they are sort of responding in a positive way to any issues and queries that they get. I'll cover DevOps and cyber in a bit more detail on some following slides. The 4th area listed there is service improvement. So they sort of work with all areas across service delivery to basically improve the process and the tech that we're running. So some examples are, we get audited on how we manage user access. So to make sure the right people have the right access, and that's been signed off. To audit that across all our user base is a pretty massive job. So they've been working on processes to make the process better, to sort of split it up into different areas, but also provide scripts and tools so we can sort of automate as much of that as possible. And the other things I get involved in is sort of upgrading our project management platform. So it's providing services to IT, but also making the processes as good as they can be. The other thing they do, they're the sort of bridge between the build half and the run half. So where the project team are building a new application or a new feature that support are going to have to run at some stage, that team will engage with them to say, right, what are the new features? Are there any new suppliers we're dealing with as part of this? Are there any sort of service level agreements we need to manage? What happens if it goes wrong? Are there any daily tasks we need to do? So all of that kind of stuff gets transitioned from the build half through to the run half through the service improvement team. Because what we don't really want is surprises at the end of the project. So they go live and then suddenly we find out there's like some massive server that we need that we didn't know about, or it's going to take an hour to set up users when that process should take 5 minutes. So it's making sure we cover as much as we can before that project goes live. So if we jump to DevOps. So DevOps is a relatively new team at Hodge, and it's a new discipline, I suppose, as well, because since we've started our sort of digital transformation journey a couple of years ago, we've needed to adopt more up-to-date working practices and methods and tooling to make sure we can support that. The traditional sort of client server applications where you sort of get one upgrade every couple of months and it's deployed once is not really a model that is used anymore. We've got sort of web apps which we need to update more frequently. They're more written in components, so you can sort of deploy sections of it at a time, but also various bits of it could fall over independently. We need to sort of the team to manage that. So DevOps, as it sort of says, is an approach to sort of smooth the path between development, the dev half, and operations, the ops half, and to try and remove the silos that sort of used to be in place in that process. And it's built on three key areas, or three key principles. One is collaboration between the teams. One is automation, so trying to automate as much as we can. This needs to be massively repeatable so we can scale the operation, but also so we can focus the teams on doing tasks which add value as opposed to doing repetitive tasks which should be automated and aren't really adding any value. And then a third principle is continuous improvement. So making sure that whatever we're running now is fit for purpose, but also working on finding better ways of doing those tasks and adopting new tech. So if we look at each of these key areas, so these aren't in the right order, apologies, I realized that earlier. So to support the development team is one of their responsibilities. So we've got development teams, like multiple development teams we have to support. And one of the things we need to do is provide them with tooling, so allowing them to spin up development environments on demand based on scripts, or to get access to test databases to run their scripts, or to spin up and destroy their environments based on changes they're making and sort of do their local testing. And it's about enabling them to self-serve where we can. So we don't really want to be getting involved with every developer and saying, right, what do you need in your environment? Right, here's your database and here's your tool set. It's like, here's a script, this will create everything you need, and that should be the way to go on that. That then follows on to a software pipeline. So once they've done their local development and they want to commit that code, then that goes onto the pipeline, it pulls in other people's changes, and then that will be built as part of the system test environment. And then as part of that pipeline, we do code analysis, we do automated testing, and then if that passes, it goes on to the next environment. So all of that is an automated process. And then following on from that, assuming all the testing is fine and the business are happy to do this and it meets the user requirements, then it gets deployed. And that deployment, if we're looking at CI/CD, which is continuous integration and ultimately continuous deployment. So if something's passed the tests and we're happy with it, it could in theory go straight through to the live environment without anybody else touching it. I think because we're a bank and we're a regulated entity, that's quite a challenge at the moment, because we need some user sign-off and visibility that the business are happy to accept that change. But we need to be in a position where we can continuously deploy software, and we are sort of heading down that road. So part of cloud deployment is getting these changes out into the live environment. So there's a couple of approaches. You could take the system down, do a manual deployment, do some testing, and then put the system back up. But in a 24/7 world, that's not really acceptable anymore. So we've moved on to what we call blue-green deployment, where we deploy the updates to one environment while the current live one is still running. We then do some check-in, then we take the current live one down, and the new one takes over, which is a lot more palatable for the business, but it's still a bit of work for the DevOps team because they've got to manually go in and make updates. Not fully manual, but they can only automate so much of this stuff. And then ultimately we'll move on to continuous deployment, where if it's good and it's passed the test, it will be deployed. And essentially we can, there's no manual interaction at that point. So that's the ultimate goal. Once it's deployed, then DevOps, as in the ops half of their world, has some responsibility for live infrastructure management. So the first point of call will always be the service desk, but if there's then issues with the instances we're running in the cloud or some kind of database issue, then it will go back to them to support that kind of thing. But again, automation is key. So if it thinks there's an issue with one of the services, it should set an alarm, which the service desk will pick up and they know how to resolve that. Or ultimately, these services should be self-healing. So if it gets a problem, runs out of memory and crashes, it should recognize that with a health check and start up a new instance. And then hopefully there's very little user interruption to that process. And then the final part is new tech adoption. This is a sort of massively quickly moving area. So what we were doing when we started this 3-4 years ago has now moved on, and there's plenty of different ways of doing things. So we're looking at running things in containers. There's lots of serverless technologies, and there's better ways of monitoring to make sure that we can preempt problems, really. So if we can see instances are running out of space, then we could automatically provision more space or memory or restart them or whatever. So we want to get to these problems before they happen, rather than waiting until it falls over and then fixing it. And there's loads of tooling available to support that. The other thing we're constantly aware of is cyber security, which again is a massive area for the bank. So ultimately, as a bank, we have 2 jobs. One is to protect customers' money, and the other one is to keep the regulator happy. If we don't do those 2 things on a daily basis, then nothing else is relevant, really. Because that is ultimately our whole purpose. Well, it's not our whole purpose, but if we're not doing those things, then we can't carry on. So we're regulated, and there's regulations covering pretty much everything. So there's regulations on financial stability, so making sure we have enough money if all the customers want their money back. We have regulations on looking after vulnerable customers and processes to sort of keep those customers safe and make sure we're aware of their needs. There's regulations on financial crime, and there's even things like you need to have resilience processes. So one of the scenarios that the regulator sort of regularly used to put out on their documentation was, how would you survive a pandemic? And everybody said, well, that's not really going to happen, so let's not worry about that kind of thing. But it did happen. So I think the last 2 years have probably been the best test of everybody's pandemic resilience plans you're ever going to get. But there are lots of those scenarios that we have to cater for. But a key area that the regulator is now concerned with is cybersecurity, because the regulators, one of their main focuses is on protecting customers. So if we aren't putting measures in place to protect our infrastructure from fraud or from customers getting scammed, then that is of detriment to the customer. So that then becomes an issue for us to sort out. Or equally, if we haven't got resilient systems and we lose all our customers' data, then that becomes a massive issue. So ultimately, it's protecting the customer, but to do that, cyber is a massive part of that. And board members have a regulatory responsibility to make sure we have decent cyber control. So it does get a fair amount of focus these days. So on this slide are the sort of key areas that we cover under cyber. So there's real-time monitoring. So we take logs from pretty much anywhere we can. So that could be a firewall at one end of our network, through to application logs, through to logs from any device that the user uses to connect to our systems. So we take all that data and we also correlate that data. So we look at the data from the various sources, and then there's tools to allow us to say, right, does this look dodgy? Is this person logging on from somewhere they don't normally log on? Is it a weird time? Have they logged on over here and then done something else on the system? So it's huge amounts of data, and then you need the ability to correlate that data, work out what it means, and then ultimately respond to it. Instant response is working out what to do when things will go wrong, because ultimately they will go wrong at some stage. It could be a small incident where you some alarm goes off and you're not sure what that system's doing, or it could be a major incident where you lose a whole system, or you get some kind of data breach. So the regulator they are concerned with what you do when it does happen, but they're also concerned with making sure you have plans in place for what would you do in this scenario, or what would you do in that scenario, just to make sure you've basically considered all eventualities. And then risk management and due diligence is another key part, because we can't do everything, because there's not enough time in the day and there's not enough money to put all the controls in place that we could. So we could put sort of detection mechanisms and firewalls in sort of every corner of our network. But ultimately, is that going to add a huge amount of value compared to the amount it would cost to install, the amount it would cost in terms of time and people to manage that? And ultimately, would it get in the way of our business if users can't get to any website without jumping through 10 hoops or logging on to 5 different systems to get somewhere? It's going to hold our business back. So there's always a balance between security, functionality, and operability, and ultimately cost. Secure development processes, again, it's a massive area on its own. So we're building our own systems, but we need to build security into that in the first place, which could just be working out what's the best way of verifying that a user is who they say they are. But also things like, if a user's tried to log on 10 times and failed, is that because they've generally forgotten their password, or is it because someone else is trying to hack their account? So then that feeds back into real-time monitoring. We'd like to know about that, even if we're not going to do anything. It's good for awareness. If that customer then rings up, we can say, well, we see you've had trouble logging on, and if they say, I haven't tried to log on today, then there's more investigation to be done off the back of that. So it all ties back into data and what you want to achieve with this stuff. And then the last point, user awareness, which is, again, I keep saying all these areas are large, but we can have all the tools we like, all the instant response plans we like, throw all the money we want at cyber as an issue, but ultimately users are the weak point in the chain, because they're human and they do things you don't expect them to, and they do things you don't like them to. So that could be writing their password down on their laptop, leaving their laptop on the train, or responding to a phishing scam, which then means their credentials are leaked and someone else has got them. So we spend a lot of time engaging with users, formal training of users, answering general users' queries, but also sort of testing our users with sort of simulated security instance, and seeing how they respond and what you do with them, and how they react to them at that stage. So yeah, users are, I suppose, my main area of concern on a daily basis. So apologies about this slide in advance, it's very messy. So one of the things Claire asked me to do for this was to sort of give a summary of what I do as part of my role. And I started putting this together, and it rapidly expanded. So what it's trying to say is the inner circle is things I'm sort of concerned with on a day-to-day basis, or what I get involved with. And then further out, this is sort of more strategic stuff or awareness. But it does show the breadth of what we get involved with. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but to call out a couple of things. So there's live issues. So ultimately, the first line of my job description says, provide a seamless and secure service to our users and customers. So if something's on fire, I need to know about it. But ultimately, I can't do all of this on my own. I can't do much of it on my own. So there's team management. So I've got a team of 4 reporting into me, and they have teams below them. So they are then responsible for certain areas we discussed, like DevOps, cyber service desk. So making sure that those people have the teams below them to do the job, and we know what's going on. We have a daily stand-up across all of service delivery with what are the key issues we need to look at, anything going on today, any updates and things like that, to try and get make sure everyone knows what's going on. And part of that is visibility and reporting. So we need to make sure users know sort of the state of systems, but also to make sure we're accountable to the business. We sort of provide stats on what we've done during the month, the state of our sort of security environment, how many calls we've had, any issues with supplies and things like that. And then moving slightly further out, there's recruitment, retention and people development. So we're in a massive, well, IT is a massive market and we're a fairly small player. So we need to get good people in. And probably more important than that is we need to retain the people we've got and make sure we develop them. So concentrating on people and development plans and making sure people are upskilled and engaged is a key part of the role of myself and sort of everyone across the team, really. Ways of working is an interesting one. So, and it sort of ties in with user expectations. So 2 years ago, everyone at Hodge, or 90% at Hodge, was based in one central square, came in 8:30, left at 5 o'clock every day and sort of logged onto a fixed terminal in the desk. Middle of March, we said, right, we think there's a pandemic coming. We're going to try and work at home one day next week, which was the 17th of March, 2019 or 2020, sorry. And we've never been back. It worked well on day one and the business decided that we should carry on for now. And I'd say 80% of the people have never set foot in the office again since. So that's a massive change. It happened overnight with a huge amount of work from the team underneath, obviously, to get it done. But it shows how we can sort of quickly adopt tech if we need to, and people can change their way of working. And we're probably not going to come back from that now. We'll always have hybrid working. So we've got to provide people with the tools to do that job, but also the flexibility so we can sort of work from the office, from remote, from wherever, and try and keep the team going on that same basis. The other ones in the outer loop is it's just things to be aware of, really. So customer experience and fintech trends. So I said earlier, our customer base has moved from an older demographic to a younger demographic. So they're more used to online banking and apps. And ultimately, they're not constrained by the 9 to 5. So if they're using our tech at 2 in the morning and there's a problem, we need to be able to respond to that. That may not be someone at the end of the phone or doing something, but we need our systems to be resilient and responsive regardless of the time of day. So being aware of what's happening in the outside world is massively important, and it's a key thing that anybody in IT should sort of keep an eye on, really. In terms of my role and how I got here, I don't know if this is a traditional route through IT or not. So I've got a computer science degree, but I've also got it's a dual honours, so I've got a music degree as well, which is a little bit odd. I don't rely on my music degree a huge amount on a day-to-day basis. So I left uni with a computer science degree, didn't really have any interest in getting a job in tech because it didn't really engage me massively at that stage. So I had a couple of random grad jobs post that, one of which was working in a manufacturing company where I got a bit of exposure to sort of reporting, but also exposure to sort of the manufacturing side of it and the sales side of things. So I was quite interested in the general sort of way businesses worked. And then I got a job as an analyst programmer, starting in C, then moving up to Visual Basic and Java. And as part of that, got an opportunity to lead a fairly small development team at that stage, which was a fairly big step up. But as part of that, because we were a relatively small team, we got exposure to everything. So we did a bit of everything from project management to business analysis to talking to the users and ultimately doing some of the live support stuff as well. So I think that's where I got my sort of wide exposure to stand me in good stead for what I do now. At Hodge, as part of our digital transformation, I got the opportunity to become architecture lead. So that's sort of looking after all of the development teams, looking at the approach to software, how we design it, building in the resilience and things like that. And then ultimately an opportunity came up to run the service side at Hodge, which I'm always told isn't a traditional route to go from sort of development into service. And most people thought I was mad, but I really like it. So yeah, that was an opportunity to use my skills or knowledge across the business to sort of formalize that really. So I'd sort of done the dev side, the build side of IT, and this was an opportunity to sort of do the run side really, to sort of get the full set. So in terms of advice, in terms of how to progress a career in tech, I'm assuming everybody on this call is in a massively good place already, because they're gaining some core tech skills, which will stand you in good stead, sort of whatever you plan to do later on. At the time, I probably didn't realize, but my computer science degree, there's a lot in there that I sort of still rely on in terms of tools and techniques, which are still relevant now in my current role as they have been in previous roles. There's a massive demand for tech skills. You probably know that. So there are lots of roles out there and available, and you'll get a role doing something in IT. But I suppose the key thing is getting a role that you enjoy and sort of getting a chance to be in a good position to sort of choose the roles by looking at what's available and understanding sort of where your interests are. So it's working out what you like, I think, is a key part of it. But also there's a lot of things you can do now to sort of stand you in good stead in terms of when we interview people at grad level. It's quite often difficult. Sometimes there's not a lot to talk about because they've got their sort of the degree and the final project and perhaps not a lot else. I think getting wide experience and things to talk about and stick on your CV now is a massive plus point for me as an employer. So it's never been as easy to get hands-on with commercial tech. You could sign up for an AWS account today, sign up for an Azure account, spin up EC2 instances, run a website, do big data stuff, find out about permissions, buckets. You can pretty much do anything, which 10 years ago, you'd have to pay a fortune to get your hands on that kind of tech. And now you can do it for free in the evening. There's meetups and groups out there. I think some of the key ones locally are the AWS South Wales group, where there's actual people from Amazon come in to talk and tell you about what happened at the last reInvent. And there's commercial people there who are demoing what they're doing in their real companies. So that's a massively good way to get exposure to what's happening in industry now. There's also South Wales Agile Group, which is run by the training lead at DevOps Group. So he's a really good person to sort of get involved with. And again, it's what's happening in the real world and talking about real projects and agile issues and things like that. I think a key thing is researching a company. If you're going to if you're interested in working for them or going for an interview, it's easy enough to read the website, but there's lots of other things you can sort of do research on, what they've seen in the news. You could apply for one of their products, see what the process is like, and then if it's a technical role, you could sort of give feedback on your thoughts on that process, which is always useful to have. And experience and placements is a key one. It's if you can actually work somewhere, even for sort of 3 months over the summer, it gives you a huge insight into the sort of real ways of doing things, and sort of again gives you something to talk about at an interview stage. And then once you're in a role, the key things I would say is learn about the business, especially from a development point of view. It's fairly easy to sort of be heads down and say, oh yeah, I'm just doing this bit of code. If it passes, I'll be fine. But if you know why you're doing that bit of code, what it leads to in the business, and ultimately what the customer requirements are for this, then it gives you a much better understanding of sort of what's going on and allows you to get involved in a wider range of things. And look up and around you, there'll always be people who, with different experiences, with more experience in different departments, who'll take an interest in what you're doing, or have an insight in their department, which then feeds into the work you're doing. And don't be afraid to ask questions. I'm always asking loads of questions still, because I'm interested in how things work. I keep learning. There's always new tools and techniques. They'll always go back to the core things, because ultimately we're still working with data, processes, computers and people, but there's always lots to learn, and sort of expand your horizons and go learn in a different sector or a different area of IT. I'm doing sort of security training at the moment, because that's sort of one area I've got exposure to, but not massively technical. So that's really interesting. Because what I ultimately look for in a person we're employing is someone who's proactive at solving problems with a sort of natural curiosity. So they want to know why things are working and how they work, as opposed to just doing what they're given. We need sort of people can sort of get involved in lots of things by asking the right questions. And that is pretty much me. So thank you for your time today. I really enjoyed this, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Matthew. That was really insightful, I have to say. We do have quite a few questions. It's interesting when you talk about sort of curiosity. One of the things I was going to say is, you know, I think we've had to be quite resilient over the last 2 years. And it seems from your presentation and talk that curiosity and resilience have probably stood you in good stead to get through the last 2 years in the pandemic in terms of business.
I think resilience is a key thing. I've never really understood what it is, but I think just it shouldn't be just getting on with things for the sake of it, but sort of being able to sort of handle challenges in a sort of positive way is a massive benefit or attribute to have, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, well, Sarah, do you want to ask a few questions from the chat?
Yeah, so we've got, what do you look for in an applicant, and what are the main skills, knowledge and competencies you expect to see of someone wanting to work in tech?
So in terms of personal attributes, I think it's like we said, sort of proactive problem solvers is how I would best describe it. So someone who sees a problem and goes, right, let's look at this. How can we tackle it? As opposed to, I've never done this before, I don't know how to do it, kind of thing. There's lots of ways of doing things. What I found is when we interview people, we'll sometimes put a scenario together, and I've never once had a candidate come back with the answer that I thought of in the first place, which is good because it shows the range of ideas that are out there. So it's making sure people can sort of get those ideas across. In terms of tech skills, any sort of good tech grounding, I think, is good, because if you've got that, then you can pick up another language or framework or technique pretty easily, to be honest.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question was, what emerging threats worry you the most?
It's a good one. So I think it's, in terms of security issues, it's the unknown, really, isn't it? Because we know we've got tools in place for sort of managing email or firewalls or limiting what users can do, but there's lots of things we haven't really thought of yet. And the main issue for Hodge at the moment is, when we had no online presence, that was ultimately as safe as we could be. Now we've got an online presence, we've got controls in place for the size we are, but ultimately if we want to grow, which we do, then we're going to have to expand our online presence, which means our sort of areas that people can attack will grow, because as we move into different, say, mortgage markets, then as well as becoming targets for internet security issues generally, online mortgage applications are susceptible to mortgage fraud. So we need tools in place to manage that, and it's making sure that as we grow, our tool set grows with us. That's the sort of key challenge where we are at the moment. And also, as our profile grows, then we could become sort of more of a target for sort of hacktivists as well. If we sort of get a profile or there's some news story that someone doesn't agree with, then there's always sort of DDoS attacks and things like that, which we sort of think we can cope with, but have never really sort of been challenged by that.
Okay, great, thank you. And then another question was that you mentioned that Hodge is working with the education institutes. What are the ways that Cardiff Met could collaborate with Hodge in learning and teaching space? For example, like seminars, student placements, as well as in terms of research, like knowledge transfer projects.
Yeah, so we have had some student placements in the past, which from our point work quite well. They're a little bit more challenging remotely because there's not a sort of team you can sit with. We've had people in before and they sort of sit with the dev team and not necessarily taking on stories, but working on their own little project, but alongside the dev team and using our infrastructure. That works pretty well. The challenge we have as a bank is we're sort of fairly locked down in security, so there's limited to what we can give people access to. But yeah, we're always happy to sort of have discussions around sort of placements. Now, as the challenges of recruiting get harder every day, one of the key things we're looking to do is actually start taking on grads or even placement people as a way of sort of growing our own talent, really, and sort of add into that sort of pool of people who are available to work on our tech. Yeah, we're happy to have discussions around other ways we can engage on this.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That's all the questions that are on the chat. I don't know if anybody wants to come onto the mic and ask any, or
Let me just stop presenting a minute. There you go.
Hi, Matt.
Jimmy, do you want to ask a question?
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Matthew, for the interesting talk. I want to ask, because our students undergoing ISO 27001 internal auditor training this week. So how much these compliance and other issues are valued in the industry at the moment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think they are useful because there's obviously a rigor involved in sort of getting those accreditations, and we do place value on those. We ourselves align to NIST because that's what our sort of previous technology or security auditors use, but it's also what the regulator tends to use. They don't call it NIST, but if you look at the detail of it, it is pretty much NIST with their badge on it. So that's what we use internally. But one of our key challenges, actually going back to a previous question in terms of what's emerging threats, I think supply chain is a massive issue. So the recent Log4j issue, it didn't impact us, but we had to go out to all our suppliers and maybe hold our data or sort of run some of our systems to say, are you impacted by this? We do for external accreditations in line with SOC 2 or ISO as verification, because we can't go out and sort of send our audit teams out to all of our suppliers. So if they've got SOC 2 or ISO, then we do place some reliance on that as a sort of start of the control regime. But we can't just say, right, you've got your ISO badge, that's it, we're not going to ask you any hard questions now. That's almost a sort of entry level requirement for us, for our suppliers, depending on what they're doing for us.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. I have one more question. So you mentioned about real-time monitoring, and you said you are combining different platforms to figure out what is happening. So yeah. Do you use an integrated platform, or you use manual labor to identify them, or you use any machine learning or artificial intelligence kind of platform?
So we actually outsource that capability at the moment. So a third party will take all of that data, and then yeah, they are doing sort of the AI stuff on it and the sort of the big data to try and correlate that kind of stuff. But it's a big area that we want to get involved in, really, because we've now got more capability and capacity in-house, and we understand it's fine for third party to do it, but they don't really understand what application A is doing compared to application B. Once you've got that context, then it makes sense for us to sort of do some of that in-house where we can, and the tooling is improving massively all the time.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chami. Okay, one more question. Has anyone got any further questions? No, I think that's it. Okay. Oh, Catherine.
Oh, no, it was just coming on to say, I know I said it at the beginning, Matthew, but thanks ever so much for your time today. It's been a really interesting talk, and you raised some really great points. I was particularly keen on the point you raised about resilience and adapting to the pandemic. And it sounds like organisationally and in terms of your working culture, you went through such a monumental shift, and that ability to adapt and roll with it. I know that's something that the students demonstrated, many of them during the pandemic. But when we talk to employers on our industrial liaison committee, that idea of resilience in graduates is a key attribute that many note. So thank you ever so much for all the insight you've given us today.
Okay, that's really good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, and thanks again, Matt. And then hopefully we can have you back again to talk to students in the future. But really appreciate the time that you've put and energy that you've put into this.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thanks a lot for your time.
All right, have a good evening, and thanks everybody else for attending.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.